Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our second session of Keeping the Promise, Core Skills for Effective Land Stewardship, hosted in partnership with the Northwest Connecticut Land Conservancy. For those just joining us, my name is Ricky Bentley. I'm the Program Manager at Connecticut Land Conservation Council, or CLCC. We are the statewide umbrella organization for Connecticut's land trusts. CLCC is dedicated to supporting land trust work through advocacy, technical assistance, and capacity building programs like this six-part webinar series. We're here to sharpen the practical skills needed to ensure the enduring integrity of our stewardship programs and uphold that forever promise we make to the land in our communities. Since we're using Zoom webinar, everyone's automatically muted and off camera. However, we want to hear from you, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll keep an eye on that throughout the session and leave dedicated time at the end for discussion. As with all sessions in the series, we're recording today. The video will be posted to our YouTube channel soon. And if you'd like to revisit, we'll send out a link and relevant resources. Today, we are going to be looking at remote tools available for stewardship, like satellite imagery, and how we can meet Land Trust Alliance standards. So happy to pass the floor back to Mary Walsh from Northwest Connecticut Land Conservancy.
Thank you, Ricky. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so like Ricky said, today we're going to be talking about remote sensing for aerial and annual monitoring. About me, I've been with NCLC since February of 2023, so just over 3 years now. I'm responsible for our aerial monitoring program and being the conservation easement manager on the ground. And I also am responsible for addressing violations and encroachments and our GIS mapping program. To give you some background on NCLC and where I'm coming from in regards to this topic, we were founded in 1965. We're lucky enough to have 11 staff members. We are the largest land trust in Connecticut by number of properties. We have a strategic goal to boldly accelerate the pace and scale of land and water conservation. And we've been through 3 mergers since 2019. So our portfolio is growing rapidly because of those 2 things. Since 2024, our average transaction size is 435 acres. We are very close to closing on a conservation easement on some water company land, which will be about 5,200 acres, so our biggest property. But the average without that property is 117 acres, so still a pretty significant size. We permanently protect over 14,400 acres, and we are located in the northwest corner of the state in Litchfield and northern Fairfield counties. We have over 500 properties, 334 fee, and 232 conservation easements. The acreage is just about split. We have 31 public nature preserves, and we protect wildlands as well as 56 working farms. Today, we're going to be talking about what remote sensing is, the LTA standards and practices, what to consider when setting up an aerial monitoring program or choosing to do so, and how to do that, how to monitor. We'll touch on maintaining strong relationships and other remote sensing tools that you might find interesting. Okay, so remote sensing is actually a science, and it is the collecting of information about Earth from a distance. This can include visuals like satellite images, but it can also include other things like infrared or LiDAR, which we'll go over in a little bit. Today, we're going to be focusing on aerial monitoring, specifically using satellite imagery. Aerial monitoring is an umbrella term that includes things like planes and drones, but we'll focus on satellite monitoring today. Okay, So one of the most important things to keep in mind with any of our stewardship practices is the Land Trust Alliance standards and practices. So if you go on their website, you'll want to take particular notice to standards 11 and 12. I do have a link here, and this will be shared after this presentation.
Mary, I think you need to share your screen still.
Oh, you haven't been able to see it this whole
Yep,
time?
sorry.
All right, one moment here. Okay, can you see it now? It says I am sharing my screen. Okay, can you see it?
Yep,
Great.
thank
Okay,
you.
sorry about that. Okay. All right, so I'll skip all this. That's all the things you just heard. Okay, so for LTA, it's required that we monitor all of our properties annually. And if you are going to use aerial monitoring, you still have to go on the ground once every 5 years. We have to document inspections promptly within 3 months. Um, and we have to address management issues in a timely manner. And all of that needs to be outlined in clear monitoring policies. And you also need to have record keeping policies. The monitoring method needs to be appropriate to the type of inspection conducted, which is a really important factor when choosing to utilize aerial monitoring. If you need to see specific things under canopy of trees, that's something to think about. And a new requirement as of 2026 is that aerial monitoring reports must be completed within the same calendar year that the image was captured. So what that means is if you get an image in December, you don't have 3 months to document that. You have until the end of the year. Okay, so what needs to be included in reports? There are certain things that need to be included in any monitoring report, like the inspection date, who's monitoring the property, what the property is, so the name of it, where it is, things like that. Observations related to the conditions and the conservation values, and if there's any potential violation or management and ownership risk. If you do take photos, those need to be included, or the location of their permanent storage needs to be included. Specifically for aerial monitoring, we also have to include the date that the image was taken, the data source, who took it, and a copy of that image or where you keep it in your files. I also want to note that the first bullet point there, monitoring or inspection date, for aerial monitoring reports, that's still the date that you are looking at it. So it is typically different from the date of the image capture. Now, terra firma, if you're not familiar with terra firma, that will be gone into in detail in one of the future webinars in this series. But it is a conservation defense insurance created by LTA, and it covers the legal costs in defending the land. It has a few different criteria, but for us today, we want to keep in mind that, again, you need that written policy. You need to monitor your properties annually, go out there once every 5 years if you're using aerial images, and you also need to have a baseline or management plan for every property. So a lot of that mirrors what's required by LTA. It does vary just a little bit, so it's important to look at the requirements of each of these organizations. Another thing to consider is that the policy begins on March 1st. So you're not thinking in the calendar year, you're thinking in your policy year for this. And you have until April 30th to place a claim. So that's an important date to keep in mind if you have any current potential violations or encroachments that happen this policy year and you're covered by terra firma because it's coming up in just a couple of days. Okay, so you're all here because you are considering having an aerial monitoring program or you already have one. There is a lot to think about if you are setting up a program like this. You need to think about your scope of work. how many properties and how big are your properties? How large is your service area? How accessible are your properties? This is a big one for an organization like NCLC, for example. And capacity. Who is looking at your properties and what's it going to take to manage this monitoring? And do you have the capacity to train everybody? You also want to consider financials. Does it fit into your budget? And what are you paying now? And what would you pay? What are you going to use the images for? You can certainly use it for monitoring, but you can also utilize it for things like outreach and management plans, baseline documentation reports. Do you have a high risk portfolio? How close are your neighbors? How many past violations are you dealing with? And what are your stewardship goals besides just fulfilling the LTA requirements? And consider your easements. If you do have easements, will the restrictions be visible from satellite imagery, or are they a little bit smaller scale and you'll need to go out there to check them out? Or are there seasonal restrictions that really depend on monitoring during that time? All right, so just to give you an idea of Connecticut land trusts, this is according to the 2020 National Land Trust Census. They recently did another census, and we'll see the results of that in 2026. So I want to note that these are old numbers and they will be higher probably now. So there are 107 land trusts in Connecticut. We average an age of 52 years, so we are aging, which means we're dealing with second, third generation easement landowners. We're dealing with a lot more development than when we first took on properties. We all together protect over 200,000 acres. And again, that will be much higher now. And there was a 32% increase between 2010 and 2020. Between the 107 land trusts, there are only 73 full-time staff members, or were as of 2020, and 111 part-time staff. So as a group, we rely heavily on volunteers and perhaps board members along with staff. Okay. The Land Trust Alliance is a really helpful remote monitoring toolkit that I highly recommend that everyone takes a look at. There were a few grants, one through LTA and NRCS. There was one through the California chapter of the Nature Conservancy that allowed land trusts to try out aerial monitoring. And then they took they had the land trust report on their findings and had a questionnaire, and all of that is outlined in this online toolkit that the LTA has published. So, a few things to consider. Portfolio. Larger properties require a lot of time to visit. And the more properties you have, the more site visits you have to do, of course. And your service area, like I said, we're in the northwest corner. We span from upper Fairfield County all the way up to the Massachusetts line. So for us, there are times when we're driving a significant distance to see properties. In this this census of land trusts that had these grants, this is what they found as far as time it takes to monitor. I do want to call out that a lot of these land trusts were in places like Colorado and California and some states in the Southeast. Connecticut is a bit unique in that our parcels are much smaller. So for you, you might not find that in-person monitoring takes 5.5 hours. But I would say that it certainly does take more time to go in person than monitor a property on the ground. Okay. We also have a lot of physical barriers here in Connecticut. Sure, we're looking at some flat meadows, but we're a mountainous region. We have extensive wetlands and we have cliff faces, and we do have some parcels that are deep within the woods. We also have canopy cover. So those areas are going to be harder to see with satellite imagery. We also have a lot of things, vegetation like Japanese barberry and autumn olive. So these invasive plants that make some places just impassable. So how does your land trust stack up when it comes to all of that? Land trusts who received the grants generally thought that using aerial imagery allowed them to see their properties in much more detail and much more completeness than if they were on the ground. So you can see here that 25% thought that it was much more complete, and 63% thought it was more complete in coverage. And then another 12% thought it was about the same or less complete than being on the ground. So that's a significant number of people who think that you can just see more if you're using satellite imagery. And I would definitely agree with that. Capacity. Like I said, we as a group generally rely a lot on volunteers, and volunteers can come and go, and volunteers have their own lives going on. So, how reliable is your volunteer base? And how capable are they of seeing these properties? We, as some of us know, we're an aging population, the land trust, stewards and volunteers and just people in this world. And as we age, of course, our physical capabilities are reduced. Um, so also, are your stewards able to handle the technologies that come with aerial monitoring? Looking at satellite imagery and really diving into that is a completely different skill set from, say, using a handheld GPS. And again, how much time do your land stewards have? Along with all the people who are doing the work, you need someone to actually set this up and manage the program. It can take a lot of time to set up an aerial monitoring procedure. So does someone in your organization have that time, and do they have that experience? And if they don't, are you going to have to hire somebody to do it for you? And then once you set it up, you're going to have to do continuous training as you have new land stewards or technology advances. You might have to update your data from time to time. And of course, you'll have to manage those finances. So it can reduce the physical strain and the time commitments of land stewards. And it can really free up time for other priorities, which is incredibly helpful as perhaps you take on more acquisitions or you have more other stewardship obligations. But it does require someone to manage this program. So who's that going to be for you? Along with financials, within this monitoring toolkit, they report that surprisingly, land trusts with fewer than 5 staff do believe that this cost is sustainable for their programs, and that number goes down the higher the staff size is, which I found a little bit counterintuitive, but it is good to know as many of us do come from smaller land trusts. There are subscription-based platforms. I'm going to go through the one that I use in a little bit, but there are also satellite providers that allow you just one-off purchases of imagery. I have found those to be higher in price, but since we do have a subscription-based platform, I haven't dug into it in very fine detail. So if someone goes out there and researches it, you might find something different, but in general, I've found that they're much more costly. But ground monitoring comes with costs as well. You might have to reimburse people for mileage. And of course, there's staff time. Do you have full-time staff members? Are you paying people by the hour? You need insurance, and you might even provide gear. So what are you giving to your stewards to go out to these properties? We don't really provide gear here, but we do things like treat clothing with permethrin, so we all are protected against ticks. So there's just some, of course, financial obligations that come along with ground monitoring. So think about, how does that compare to how much it would cost to remote monitor? Okay, so I went into this a little bit, but you can use this for annual monitoring, which is what we're focusing on today, and that does satisfy accreditation requirements, and it provides a different perspective. But you can also use it for BDRs and management plans. It's very helpful to take a photo that's just, a snapshot in time so that you can see how the landscape changes over time. It can also be a very powerful tool to share with your community and your land trusts. Connecticut has such an interesting history, and sometimes illustrating that with images is a great way for people to learn. On the right here, you can see my neck of the woods. This is Lake Lilanona in Brookfield. That's a dammed portion of the Housatonic River. On the top is an image from 1934. NCLC now owns a lot of the land south of what you see there. And you can see there were agricultural fields and, this relatively thinner river, as opposed to in 2023, where those agricultural fields to the south of the river have been have grown in, have been abandoned, and are now forested land. And you can see that with the dam in place, that water level has gone up significantly. These images were not provided by our subscription-based platform. These are actually available through CT Eco, which is a collaborative between Yukon and Deep. They have a lot of wonderful data on their website, including this aerial imagery viewer, which allows you to compare images over the years, going back to 1934 here on top. This is not updated regularly enough to rely on for annual monitoring. So I do want to make sure to call out that. Okay, we talked a little bit about what risks are to portfolios. If you have a lot of past violations and there's a risk that these are going to continue, or you need to keep an eye on them closely, aerial monitoring of those properties might not be the right approach. Proximity to neighbors. This land around us is developing rapidly in some places. So is there a chance that these boundaries are going to be crept across? Or again, we're getting older as land trusts. So if there's new landowners who might not be as familiar with our organizations as people in the past, they might just go ahead and clear your woods and not even realize what's going on. This is, if you, all of us have different stewardship goals. So this is a really powerful tool for seeing the property as a whole. But if you have a property where the goal is to keep an eye on a threatened or endangered species, this isn't going to help you. If you need to go out there and clear trails and keep a close eye on things like if there's ATV tracks, this might not be the best approach. On the right here, this is again through CT Eco, through their elevation viewer, and it utilizes a remote sensing method called LiDAR, which we'll go into in a moment. On the top here, this is LiDAR from 2016. Our property is north of the yellow line, so we actually border this property on 3 sides. Towards the northern tip there, you can see that the land has changed quite a bit. There's been a lot of regrading there. So the slope is steep and it's near our boundary. And on the bottom, you can actually see that there's a bit of a ravine forming there. This is loose sand and soil, and looking at our aerial imagery, we became very concerned. And when we went out there, we confirmed that all this sediment on this slope was indeed going into our property, and it accumulated to over a foot in some areas of our woods. So we didn't come across this through this LiDAR image, but it is interesting to see how this developed over time. Easement restrictions. Can they be seen through satellite images? If they can't, this does not account as appropriate stewardship. So will the vegetation block major violations? And again, are there seasonal restrictions that really need to be seen during certain times of the year? Things like that could be the amount of mowing allowed. If you're looking at images from December, you're not necessarily going to be able to tell what the landowner was doing in the summer. And reserved rights, again, can they be properly viewed and documented? This is a good example of one thing that we could see. The easement landowner put a shed up and they thought it was fine, but when we looked at our property boundaries and we saw it on the satellite image, we realized that it was within the protected portion of the property and not allowed by the easement. So things like sheds, these big, larger geometric shapes, are easier to see than some smaller uses. Okay, so you've decided to utilize aerial monitoring in your stewardship program. There's a lot of things to consider even closer, and also a lot of things that you need to do. Consider site suitability. You don't need to see 100% of your properties. You can choose which ones are good candidates for this. You'll have to have digitized boundaries for all of these. You'll have to have proper training. You'll still have to monitor them annually, but you have to be prepared to conduct follow-up visits or order additional imagery if necessary. LTA standards and practices, number one, make sure that you are abiding by all of these. Know that you still have to monitor on the ground every 5 years. And one thing that I think is going to be increasingly important is to keep up with technological advances. So is your site suitable? We went over some of this, but I'll add a little bit more here. Are there hard to reach places? Does it cost you quite a bit to monitor these properties on the ground? And the cost of that can be time for your staff and travel time, but also think about things like greenhouse gas emissions. If you're driving a long way away, you're contributing to that on a local level. You can only do it if high resolution imagery is available, and that shouldn't be a problem if you have a subscription or you're ordering imagery, but still something to think about. Appropriate visibility and safety risks. All of those point to, yes, the site is suitable and you can continue on. No, you don't have digital boundaries, then that's one of the first steps in having a program like this. If you don't have digital boundaries, then it's not suitable. If there's a history of threats, it may not be suitable. The easement terms can't be defended, like those smaller easement terms that we were talking about. Is there any reserved right that is happening or going to come that you need to see in close detail? And are there recent ownership changes? If there are, you might want to go out there. And if you're unfamiliar with the property, I think this one's really important. Stewards should know their properties, right? We want to know these on a bit of a personal level. If all you're doing is seeing them from a great height, then you might not have the full picture. Okay. So digitizing boundaries. A lot of land trusts, NCLC included, have historically relied on publicly available tax parcels. If you came to my CLCC workshop, this might look a little bit familiar to you. These tax parcels are available online. Municipalities are required to update these and provide them to the state annually. They're basically online assessor maps. So when you click on them, you can see who owns the property, what its assessed value is, and data that goes along with that. They are consistently inaccurate, in some places more than others, but on the ground, you can ground truth that a little bit. We have things like, stone walls and property pins. But if you don't have your boundaries properly digitized, you lose those details. So what can you do? Sure, you can go out and take GPS points. They're not always completely accurate either. You can do something called georeferencing a survey, or work with a licensed surveyor to get these digital boundaries. So they might be able to provide GPS points to you. They might be able to provide you a digitized map. Having a certified survey is the only legally defensible boundary determination. So that's something to keep in mind. That's of utmost importance. But we cannot, either on the ground or using aerial imagery, we can't properly steward our lands if we don't know where we're supposed to be doing that. This image on the left, landowner called me and was concerned that their trail was actually encroaching on their neighbor's property because they were using an app that relies on this publicly available tax parcel data. When I utilized our in-house tools, I found that it actually wasn't. And this was a great chance to connect with that landowner and educate them on the difference and between these publicly available tax parcels and their property survey. Okay, so I mentioned georeferencing. This is the tool that I use to gain an understanding of our property boundaries. And I know a lot of other land trust staff and volunteers utilize this as well. Basically, what this is, I like to think of it as pinning a flat survey onto a globe using points and aligning the features of the survey to these points on the globe. This can be done using free tools like QGIS. I use Arc Pro, that is software from a company called Esri, or you can have a GIS professional do this for you. When I do georeferencing, I like to look at LiDAR images, which is what I mentioned before. This is a remote sensing method. So again, a science that uses lasers to create 3D maps of terrain. It actually goes through vegetation and it creates these beautiful maps that can be used to see ground conditions. People do really neat stuff like that, like discover ancient civilizations and rainforests. Apparently, there was something on NPR about that recently. I haven't had a chance to listen yet. But we here in Connecticut can see things like stone walls, we can see stream beds, we can see ravines, we can see cliff faces, all of those kinds of neat features. Here in the northwest corner, we can see charcoal mounds from the old iron mining industry. Okay, so here's an example. I took our survey in the highlighted yellow, that's where stone walls are, that I used as points to pin this survey onto a globe. And then I traced those boundaries to create a pretty accurate map of our property. Again, this is not a survey. This is approximate, but I found that it gets pretty close. I was able to use these boundaries, and I went out with the landowner, and a stone mound in the middle of the property was called out on the survey, and we found it right exactly where we thought it was. So it's a pretty good starting point. Okay, once you have those digitized property boundaries, it's time to think about what you're going to use to monitor. We use a software called Lens, which is by a company called Upstream Tech. They provide a lot of satellite imagery that is free to users, things through NASA, the European Space Agency, amongst other things. And then they also provide images from satellite providers like Airbus, Nearmap. Those names might not mean anything to you if you're not in this world, but those images are generally available within days of when they're captured. It is subscription based. Plans for nonprofit organizations start at $5,600 per year. So for some of us, that can seem like a pretty significant number. And then there's a small fee for ordering imagery. To give you an idea of what a large land trust like NCLC pays, we pay a little over $6,100 a year and about $1,000 in ordered imagery a year. That for us averages out to about 2 acres or $2 per acre. So when we think of it that way, it's a little bit more digestible. But if you are a smaller land trust and you have a limited budget, definitely be aware of that. Lens also, in addition to capturing or providing imagery from these satellite providers regularly or every few months, they do allow you to task imagery, so to order additional captures. And for those of us who are familiar with geographic information systems, GIS, you should know that they do provide, for the most part, geotiffs and WMTS files, which basically just means that you can put the image on a three-dimensional surface and it will automatically go to where it is geographically, which can be helpful. Okay, steps for monitoring. It's really important that we review the image quality. If it's good enough, we order it, we look at it, and we create a report. Easy and quick, as we saw in that graph earlier. Things get a little bit more time consuming if there's a possible violation in encroachment. This is the same as if it was noticed on the ground, right? So you want to look at it a little bit closer, document everything, and then with aerial monitoring, go out there. So be prepared for a follow-up site visit and place a terra firma placeholder claim if you need to. That can be done at any point within your year. Get a survey if needed and work to resolve it and continue to monitor it. I also want to again stress that you need to document this in great detail as much as you can, every step of the way. So reviewing image quality. Here in Connecticut, we need sub-meter imagery, which means that the pixels are smaller than 1 meter by 1 meter. In our area, because the parcels are so small, because we have so many neighbors, because our properties are vegetative, that level of quality is essential. In some other places in the country where it's all, thousands of acres of farmland, it might not be perhaps as important, but here it is. On the right-hand side, the first image is a 1.15 meter resolution image. So each pixel is 0.15 meters by 0.15 meters. And with that, you can see in great detail that there's what appears to be a structure across the boundary. The middle one is a little more pixelated than I would expect, but is more typical of what you'll get for imagery. It's 0.5 meters by 0.5 meters. This would still be enough to cause concern for us. And then at the bottom, 1.5 meter quality image, clearly not good enough. So if I saw that was the quality of the image, I wouldn't even spend the money to order it. Time of day. If you have an eastern facing mountain face and the image is taken late in the afternoon or the evening, it might be too dark to see the property in any level of appropriate detail. Cloud cover, of course, you don't want images that are covered by clouds, and you hope and you plan for using leaf off images. Images taken in July are not nearly as helpful as images taken in early April, let's say. Okay, Lens provides all this information before you go ahead and purchase the image, which is incredibly helpful. You're not completely in the dark when choosing what images to order. Okay, once you have the image, you of course have to inspect it. Lens lets you compare images year to year with this slide rule in between, so you can actually go back and forth and look at that, which can be really neat. That little video just right there showed a property where a beaver moved on. There's not as much water there anymore. All right, so here's some examples of how we interpret images. Some of this was done by past land stewards when our program was still pretty new, and some of them are more recent. So here was an unidentified object. It's obviously brighter than the surrounding landscape. It's an interesting shape. It's a little bit more geometric in shape than the surrounding trees, and it wasn't visible in past imagery. So land steward went out there, walked the property, and you might be able to guess what this actually was, but it turned out to just be a tree. The reason it wasn't visible in past images is because in this one, the sun was shining on it just right, that the top of the tree looked much brighter than it typically does. So it really called it out and made it much more pronounced. So the steward at the time just wasn't able to compare the images and see that same tree. But not a problem. Okay, here's another one, another unidentified object. There's no tree cover here. It's irregular, it's beige. I look at this and I think, is that a sand pit or what is that? What is going on? So we look at imagery nearby and we always compare the imagery to past previous years, and we don't just do the last year, we'd go back a few years. So on the left, we have a nearby wetland. It's actually that same one from a couple slides back that we slid back and forth between the years. You can notice that the water is really bright, much brighter than it appears in images from other years. And the previous year image has something in that same spot, and it turns out it was a pond. The reason it looks so bright is because that light was shining on it in just the right way that it was a cause for concern. And the only way to figure that out was to look at the other images of nearby boundaries. I also just want to recognize that these green images are from July, so they have leaf on, and we did go ahead and order those images, and we did look at them closely, and we did write monitoring reports for them. But we also, towards the end of the year, when there was leaf off imagery, ordered that as well and created more monitoring reports. Okay, another one. We looked at this. This is one that I found, and I became incredibly concerned about this stream buffer. This is an easement. One of the purposes of the easement is to protect this stream. They are not supposed to cut around it. So I looked at this and I saw that the stream bank was smooth and it was beige in coloring, and it definitely caught my eye. So I looked at the last year's images and I saw a really clear buffer around this. So in this one, you can see on the southern end there that it looks like there's vegetation. On the northern end, it looks like there's not. And looking at the past images kind of confirms that. So I contacted the landowner and I went out there, and this is what I saw. The landowner did say that there was a lot of beaver activity in the area, which we do know to be true. We actually neighbor their property on the south. We have a public nature preserve there, so we're very familiar with the beaver activity. And I did see some signs of that, but I also saw trees that had a straight cut across. And if you look on the bank there, you can see that it's mowed. There's no vegetation there. So sure, there might have been a little bit of beaver activity, but that's not all that was happening, and that was pretty clear. So I followed up with the landowner and we talked about it, and I explained the terms of the easement and how this was a violation, and all of that. We went through the whole process and they agreed to follow the easement terms, and all was well and good. They're not actually the ones who maintain the property. They have a property manager. So we left on pretty good terms. Fast forward to the next year, on the left here is what I see. So you can actually see the lines where they mow the field, and you can see around the buffer of the stream how they turned their mower and did the lines mowed that way. So not great, not what we were hoping for. So I reached out to the landowner again, and I recognized that they're not the ones to do the work, but this was still happening. We got imagery in 3 months later, and you can see that they talked to whoever was mowing, and there's now vegetation growing in around the stream. Even still, this is something that we're monitoring very closely. So this is not the end of the story here. This is a property that will require a little bit more care going forward. Okay, so here's a little bit more detail on another potential violation that we found. A neighbor was building a home and paved a long driveway that was incredibly close to our boundary. Through just an error on the town's part, we weren't made aware of any construction by the neighbor, and we only found this when we did because of this imagery that came in. So we went out there, we contacted the landowner, and again, remember that if it's an easement, in this case it wasn't, but if it's an easement, you might have to do that. We always speak kindly to everyone, and we included them in the site visits. When we go out there, we never speak in absolutes, and that's something I recommend, because if you then go back and talk to an attorney and they interpret something different, then that can be a really tricky thing to navigate. So voice your concerns, but don't say anything right there, and then that could get you in trouble later. We kept the landowner updated throughout the process. They were really easy to work with in this case, but if they're not, you have to be ready to assert yourself, which is what we had to do with that stream buffer example, unfortunately. We did not have a good enough survey for this property to be absolutely certain of the extent or of any violation. So we did have to go out there, and we found some pins, and we did collect GIS points, but we did hire a licensed surveyor and got a map created by them. We always do ask if a landowner or a neighbor will share the cost if we are on friendly terms with them. In this case, they didn't share the cost, so we had to go ahead and do it anyway, but it's always worth it to ask if you can. We did ask the surveyor for the GPS points, and we kept detailed records that this work had been done. And once again, surveying is the only legally defensible boundary. You need to work with a licensed surveyor if there is any question of where a property boundary is. So be prepared to do that. And I will say, since starting our aerial monitoring program, we've come across a lot more potential encroachments and violations. And we saw in those results of that survey of those land trusts earlier that that we are in agreement pretty much that you get a much more cohesive picture of your properties, which can lead to a lot more violation observations. So be prepared for that and the cost that will come with it. And that's a good thing, right? We are required to properly steward our lands and protect them in perpetuity. So although it might cost extra and make more work for us, this is actually a really good thing. All right, so once we had the surveying done, in this case, we posted the boundaries and we continue to monitoring closely. So we will go out on the ground more often and we keep in touch with the neighbor. They're actually an incredibly good, volunteer to us, and they have called with concerns of activities happening on the property. And just keep an eye on things for us. So working with them closely has actually been a really, really great thing. And again, always document every single step of the way. So just to recap, when do we conduct follow-up visits? If there's any unidentified object, go out there. If there's any question of what's going on, just go out. Obviously, if you see something that's potentially off, you'll need to go out. If you notice that there's some sort of drop in vegetation, that's an important thing to keep an eye on, and you might want to follow up on that to make sure nobody's clearing your land, or even if there is a natural event. Like in Brookfield, down in Brookfield where I live, we had macrobursts and microbursts a few years ago that significantly changed the landscape. So that's something that might come up in aerial imagery and point to where exactly those events happened and guide your stewardship. If you need to follow up on past issues, you should still go out there. And if there's a new threat of an encroachment or a violation, you should go out there. So if you see that there's a new subdivision next to your property, or if there's some even construction of one home, like in the past example, it's worth it to go and make sure everything is okay. Okay, but sometimes you will consider ordering additional imagery if all of that isn't good enough. So Lens does allow you to order additional imagery, as I mentioned before, and they do have some guarantees. They guarantee that there will be less than 30% cloud cover. They guarantee that they'll capture the image so that the sun is between 60 to 90 degrees from the Earth. So you're not going to get images from 6 p.m. And they'll recapture if it snows, which is very helpful. But it also is a good reminder that you should not wait until last minute. If you're missing images or your images aren't good enough to properly defend the conservation values of your properties, you should consider ordering images as soon as leaves are off the ground. Don't wait until December because they do require a month notice. And if you wait until December, you're not going to get that imagery in time, or you're not going to have time to complete the monitoring report within the same calendar year. So timing is of the utmost importance. So you might consider this if you, again, don't have those images and you can't fulfill those monitoring obligations, you might have to order images. We have used it for baseline documentation reports. It's a whole lot more helpful if you have current imagery than if you're relying on, let's say, the public CT eco image from 2023. You can also use it in management plans. It can be an incredible tool for outreach to easement landowners, community members, preserve neighbors, and it can be very helpful when establishing a timeline or documenting the evolution of a violation or an encroachment. We did have to do this once in a pretty big batch for some of our properties, and we learned a lot of lessons. So before I showed you some images from July, those ones with the very bright water features, and I mentioned that we did order them and write reports for them, but we weren't happy with that. That didn't do it for us, and we didn't think it would satisfy the LTA requirements. So we ordered more imagery that we received in November. It has leaf off, which is great, but there were a lot of problems with it. The images were incredibly blurry. They were sub-meter and so they were within the resolution requirements, but that was very surprising to learn. They're dark and the image is shifted. If you look on top, it shows our boundary actually going through a road, which you might be able to see, hopefully. If you can't, that illustrates how dark it was. So what I did is I compared those boundaries to past years and I measured the difference. It was about 10 feet in most places. And so every single property boundary, I had to go and I had to look at the direction of the shift and I had to measure 10 feet and I had to really consider closely if there was a potential violation or encroachment, which was time consuming and not the best. So I did contact Lens. This was in 2023, and at that point, they weren't willing to do anything about it. Their customer service is absolutely fantastic. I know our customer service representative very well at this point. They're very responsive. They are improving all the time. So this was the case in 2023. I don't know how it would be if this were to happen now. We documented all of this in our monitoring report. So I mentioned that this was follow-up imagery. I mentioned that there was a shift and that we recognized that and looked at it in greater detail. So all these internal thoughts and processes I made to document, made sure to document. And I followed up if there was any question about anything as far as defending the conservation values of the properties. So be prepared for something like that to happen if you choose this path. And it again illustrates that knowing our property boundaries is of the utmost importance. If I use those publicly available tax parcel data, well, then we're talking about two different factors, that and the shift in imagery that would just completely change an understanding of a property. And be prepared as always to go out in the field. Okay, so like I said, Lens is advancing all the time, as is all of our technology. I think we're all incredibly aware of AI. It's coming on fast. Lens is in beta testing with AI, and it looks like there's going to be a lot of really great features, but they're not quite there yet. I imagine they will be soon, and other AI companies will get there too. LTA doesn't cover this in their standards and practices right now, so it's something to keep an eye out on in the future. I'm sure at some point the standards and practices will be updated to talk about this. And also internally, if your organization doesn't have an AI policy, now might be the time to start considering that. But in the future, this is going to be a really neat tool. We expect it to be able to detect changes in greater detail than it already does. And not only will it tell you if there's changes, but it will actually be able to call out what those are and what the cause might have been. So right now, on the image on the bottom, it would take a person to know those are cars. That's a shed. But in the future, AI will be able to call that out. So it'll look at past images, it will just learn what a car looks like, and it will be able to call that out for you. So instead of coming across these unidentified objects, it might be able to point you in the right direction and or tell you what exactly it is you're looking at. It will be able to do this in real time. So it will be able to look at these satellite images and just immediately be able to process it. It might be able to automate reports. That's something that I would be concerned about, and I'm sure will be addressed at some point by LTA. I would imagine that it would still always need human review. It will do landscape tracking. It will tell you what you should look out for in the future. And I think it's going to really, really change the game. So think about that, what your capacity is now, what your technological abilities are now, but know that it will change, and don't get left behind. I know some of us are really hesitant to use AI, and I understand those concerns completely. But it's here and it's happening, and it's good to be educated on. There's already some AI. AI is an umbrella term that encompasses a lot more than you might recognize at first. Lens can track changes in vegetation, and this is not a person going through the whole nation and calling these out. This is a computer doing this and automating this and notifying you of if there's changes in vegetation. You can look at this and track that over time, and it can be very helpful. This is that property that the neighbor had started to construct a home on. And you can see on the left-hand side, it's green, it's dark. There was a lot of vegetation there. On the right-hand side, it's yellow and orange. That vegetation has been cleared, and it can pinpoint when it happened to an extent. So this can be another interesting tool to use when tracking potential violations. It shouldn't be used on its own, but it's a tool in your toolkit. All right. This is all happening on a computer, right? We're sitting in our offices and doing this. We're on our own, or we're working with a colleague. So we, with this, might not have the opportunity to meet with community members or easement landowners as much as we might if we were out in the field. So how do we maintain those relationships? We educate our members on the technologies that we're using. So I send letters to easement landowners, for example, and let them know that we're utilizing satellite imagery to monitor the protected portions of their properties. I always make sure to say the protected portions of their properties, because if you say your property, people might get a little nervous about that. Why are you looking in my backyard? Why are you looking at my house? So that's something important to say. Things like Google Earth and Google Maps can help with this communication quite a bit. People are already familiar with what this is, what this looks like. It's not coming out of left field. It hopefully doesn't feel too big brother-ish to them. I also always offer to visit sites in person. We have a 5-year rotating schedule for our properties because, as you'll remember, the LTA requirement is that you need to see properties once every 5 years, at least, on the ground. So we do that through a rotating schedule. But even if a property is not scheduled for a ground visit that year, the landowners always know that we are available to walk a property with them. And in fact, we're happy to do so, and we would look forward to that chance to connect. We also sometimes share these images with our landowners or even our neighbors. This is a new property of ours on the right-hand side. This is called Mildy Farm, and it will be a public nature preserve. We received OSWA funding for it, which requires it to be open to the public. It's not yet. but it will be this year, which is very exciting. So I worked with our development team here in-house, and I made a map with aerial imagery. And I worked with them to make a nice layout, and they sent it to our neighbors along with a letter. And you can see on the bottom right that we actually use this as a chance to get people engaged and tell them that we can only do this with their support. And we put a little QR code there to hope that people would donate to our efforts. So having this map changes people's perspective of it. It's all well and good to tell people that there's going to be a 670-acre public nature preserve in their neighborhood. It's a whole other thing to show them where that is. We also use these in publications sometimes, and we make sure to always be available for people with questions and concerns because those do absolutely arise. Okay. For those of you in the northwest corner, I want to point out that we do have a partnership program with Upstream Tech, which is the lens company, and they offer 50% discount to eligible partner organizations within NCLC's focus area. And you do have to have an operating budget of less than $750,000 a year or less. But if you do meet those requirements, you can certainly reach out to us and we can talk more about the program. Okay, so now I'm going to open it up for questions.
We have one question already in the chat. We have some areas which are thick with mountain laurel or wetlands. Some have suggested monitoring using their hobby drones for those areas. Are there protocols or LTA guidance on this approach?
So the LTA requirements would be the same as aerial monitoring. You'd still have to go out on the ground every 5 years. With drones, I believe you do need a license, and I'm not completely familiar with it, but I believe that you need permission to go over other people's land. If anybody else in here has more information on that, please chime in because I'm not completely familiar with drone capture. We did experiment with it for a very brief time before I started at the organizations, and I think there is a lot of benefit to it. But it still requires someone to be out there and fly the drone. So it can be helpful in areas like with thick vegetation. Mountain laurel is a great example. But just, consider again that cost benefit analysis and the time it takes.
Does the 50% off require for all service area to overlap with NCLC or just some properties?
Do you mean, I think what they mean is, do they need to be completely within our service area or can they just have a few properties within it?
Think so? I think that seems.
That's a great question. I can certainly ask Amanda Branson, who's the one here who runs that program. So definitely send a follow-up email to me and we can get to the bottom of that.
Mary, I'm curious if you feel that volunteers can still play a meaningful role in a remote heavy monitoring program. Like could volunteers be trained to do first pass imagery review?
Absolutely, with the right volunteer. Um, I wouldn't have a new volunteer do it, but if it's someone that you trust who's been active in the organization for a little while, who knows your portfolio, who knows your goals, who knows the ins and out of your properties, I would say certainly. When it comes to just utilizing the imagery for monitoring, there's a lot less education than is needed for actually managing the program. One thing I will say is not only should they be trained in the monitoring process, but they certainly need to know the LTA requirements, and they also need to know things like the easement terms. So, and that's the same for on the ground monitoring, but reading easements, reading deeds in case they have restrictions, reading management plans and baseline documentation reports, those are still very important steps within that process that any volunteer should be prepared to do.
So, anyone else like to ask any questions of Mary on this topic? Not, we can close it
All
down
right.
and
Well, you can always reach out to me if you think of any questions or if you want to discuss this in any further detail. My information is here, and we will have this available after we conclude this webinar. And I do have more resources here, links to the census, that remote monitoring toolkit, which again, I can't recommend highly enough, and some free and open GIS websites, as well as the lens pricing and information. Okay, well, thank you very
thank you.
much, Ricky, and thank you everybody who came.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary. Thank you to everyone. And we'll be back next Tuesday, same time, same place. Hope to see you all there.